Hello everybody. Today I'm going to talk about Fanny Eaton, who combined a life as a working woman, as a charwoman, laundress, cook, with becoming one of the most beautiful and widely admired models of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Now, Fanny was always aware of her roots and she remained a working woman all her life. But she had this part of her life which made her extraordinary. And one of the reasons she was extraordinary was her beauty. She was very, very beautiful. She was born in Jamaica in 1835. Her mother was called Matilda Foster. Her mother had been a slave. Now, Fanny did not take Matilda's second name on her birth certificate. Instead, she was given the name of Antwistle. It is thought that probably this is because her father was a Brit who was living there. She was obviously illegitimate, but she took his name, it is thought, her mother gave that name in her birth certificate. Now, in Jamaica had seen one of the greatest uses of slaves in the whole of the British Empire. It was said at one point that 9 out of 10 people in Jamaica were enslaved. There'd been a series of revolts by slaves against their colonial masters. I don't like to use that word. They're colonial kidnappers, really. And this had culminated when in 1834, slavery was eventually discontinued in the British Empire. The slave trade had been stopped in 1807, but slavery itself remained in the British Empire, and it was 1834 when it was at last stopped. Now, Fanny's mother had been a slave. We know that. Now, whether she was in the apprenticeship scheme, we don't know. The apprenticeship scheme was a very cruel way of keeping people working after they had become free. In 1834, all the slaves were freed, but the ex-slaves were expected to work for their masters for another 4 years under the apprenticeship scheme. So they were still bound labourers, really. But Fanny was born in 1835. 1 year after the abolition of slavery in Jamaica. That made her a free citizen of Jamaica and the British Empire. And so Fanny herself was free, although her mother had been a slave. So what we find out about Fanny and her mother is that at some point in the 1840s, they went to live in London. They emigrated. We don't know how they managed to afford it. Maybe Fanny's father had some part to play in giving them the money for the fare. Maybe they'd saved. Maybe they had other friends who helped them. We don't know. But what we do know is that in 1851, in the census in London, they were recorded as living in London at that time. And Matilda was at that time a laundress and Fanny was a servant. So they'd found jobs and they were working. The London of that time was very, very different from the London of now. The areas in which they were living in were desperately overcrowded, dirty, insanitary. The lodging houses where people would stay were crammed full of people and the streets were filthy. There was malnutrition, there was disease. It was not as it is now. It was a difficult place to live. But they had decided that this was where they wanted to be because the economical advantages were greater than in Jamaica. They had more opportunity to make a life. And Fanny did actually make some kind of an extraordinary life for herself. Now, in 1857, she married James Eaton, who was a cab driver. Now, not the black cabs that we know that kind of tootle around the streets. No, it was a horse-drawn cab driver. And as far as we know, they had a happy marriage. They had 10 children altogether. 10 children, can you imagine? And in 1858, their first daughter was born, and they called her Matilda. So that was their first daughter born. But at the same time as working and bringing up a small child, Fanny was branching out into a different field of work. There are receipts that the Royal Academy has found which are signed by Fanny in receipt of money she received for working as an artist's model. So she was starting to work as an artist's model in the Royal Academy at that time. Also, she started to get to know some of the artists who were around the fringe of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Someone called Simeon Solomon, who was a young painter. He was only 19. And Fanny's first real taste of public admiration was when the picture that she is the lead in, The Mother of Moses, was exhibited in the 1860 Royal Academy Art Exhibition. So it was The Mother of Moses, and she stands there in this picture holding a baby. And remember that she had a baby at home that she was still looking after. So there's real maternal feeling in that pose holding that baby. And it was a great hit in the 1860 autumn exhibition. Simeon also drew a number of very, very beautiful charcoal sketches of Fanny. He was obviously fascinated with her face and with her hair. She was so stunning looking. He was also married to another painter called Rebecca Solomon, and she painted a lovely painting of Fanny, and it's called The Young Teacher. And in it, Fanny is the governess or nurse to two young children, and one of them is pretending to show her something in a book. It's rather a touching picture, and if you can imagine, she very likely was doing the same thing at home with her own children, although it was probably not nearly such a nice background, and whether or not they had books and things, whether or not they had the money for them, I don't know. One of the interesting things about Fanny is that she had this other life. In the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, there were a number of male artists at the centre of it. And then there were also a number of female artists who are being re-evaluated now because they produced some very beautiful work. And it seemed like it was a very bohemian setup. People had affairs with each other. There's one of the artist models, Elizabeth Siddal, was the mistress of Rossetti and went on to marry him. And she also went on to become an artist. So it was very much a kind of bohemian, happy-go-lucky type of place where anything went, really. Only one sense is with Fanny, it didn't, because she had her family and her babies back home. So while she was sitting and modelling for these beautiful pictures, she was grounded and she was not leaving her husband or having affairs with anybody else. She was doing this to get money for her babies, basically. And in doing so, she enabled some of the Pre-Raphaelite brethren to produce some of the most beautiful pictures that really are outstanding. The Pre-Raphaelites wanted to go back to a style which was, as the name suggests, Pre-Raphael. And they used very bold, intense colours, and their pictures were very, very realistic. They had tinges of the medieval about them, and tinges of otherness, of being a bit wilder than the Victorian society that surrounded them. And it seemed that Fanny had the look that they wanted. Now, what happened with Fanny was she went on and she modelled for quite a few of the Pre-Raphaelite brethren. But in 1881, her husband died of blood poisoning. And she was by now working as a needlewoman. So she was continuing to work. and she was a single woman supporting 10 children. She worked as a housekeeper and later as a cook. Now, it's thought that by this stage she didn't model so much, although there are a couple of other pictures where she is thought to have been the model for. But in terms of the major Pre-Raphaelite brethren, Dante Gabriel Rossetti painted her in The Beloved, or The Bride, and she's in the background there. You can see her in the background. And he also painted a study, well, this was a drawing, a study of a young woman, And so she was painted by some of the greatest. John Everett Millais painted her in his painting Jephthah, and that was very well received as well. She had absolutely amazing beauty. Now, one painter who painted her and made her look absolutely beautiful was Joanna Mary Wells, who painted under her maiden name of Boyce, and she made her beautiful. I mean, she was beautiful, but I think the women's pictures of her are slightly softer, slightly more infused with maternal feeling. So what happened to her next? Well, she continued to work. She worked as a cook, she worked as a housekeeper. She worked well into her 70s. This was not a time when you could retire. But fortunately, as she got very old, she moved in with her daughter, Julia, and it was there that she died, at Julia's house, in 1881. One of the most beautiful women of the Victorian era, who also was not too proud to look after her babies by cleaning, by cooking, and by being a housekeeper. And we are lucky in that we have the pictures of her to remember her beauty and how it was celebrated by some of the most gifted painters of the Victorian age. And that's it for now, folks. Bye-bye.